Good morning, everyone, or afternoon in New Zealand. My name is Kim Randall, and I am your host for today's webinar. Um, it's a pleasure to meet you all. I will just briefly introduce myself before we get into the webinar, but do want to make this webinar as interactive as possible. So please feel free to ask questions, raise your hand, or speak at any time. So I am the co-founder and CEO of Fair Supply. I have a background in human rights law. I worked in private practice and then pivoted my career to human rights when I took the job as Senior Director of Corporate and Legal at International Justice Mission Australia. And it was there that I was responsible for the advocacy of the Modern Slavery Act in 2017 and 2018, right before the Modern Slavery Act came into effect in Australia. And so I saw how quickly the act went from an advocacy issue to something that organisations were required to educate themselves on and comply with almost overnight. So have been on the journey with Australian companies for nearly 7 years now. And through that time, Fair Supply has created a software which assists companies identify their modern slavery risk, undertake due diligence with their suppliers, and mitigate that risk through both technology and consulting services. So I'm really excited to begin the journey with New Zealand businesses. We're doing some great work at the moment with Air New Zealand, OCS, and some energy companies in New Zealand. So have traveled back and forth for a few years now, but as you're all aware, we weren't sure what was going to happen with this piece of legislation in New Zealand. We are excited through years of advocacy for it, that it's looking like this legislation will come into effect, which will very much level the playing field. We partner with Walk Free, who have been doing some excellent advocacy in New Zealand. The Minderoo Foundation, which Walk Free are part of, are an investor in our business. So we've recently issued some latest research in Australia, at least with Walk Free, on how many goods and services in each industry are tainted by modern slavery. So that's way too much about me. Let's get into it. If we just go to the agenda. What we're going to be discussing today is just an introduction and overview, and what are the proposed requirements under the New Zealand Modern Slavery Bill, how New Zealand businesses should be preparing and why they should be preparing now before the bill becomes legislation. And then we're going to save quite a lot of time at the end for audience Q&A and discussion. So let's get started. Why is New Zealand considering a modern slavery legislation? So the data that we have is, according to the Global Slavery Index in 2023, New Zealand has 8,000 people, or a prevalence of 1.6 per 1,000 people living in modern slavery. Which is really, that is still, while it is a low number relative to population, it's still, a very disturbing number in circumstances where lots of people think of modern slavery as something that, had been eradicated a long time ago, but it actually still exists today in New Zealand. But the other reason why New Zealand is looking at a Modern Slavery Act is because it actually imports $7.9 billion worth of goods at risk of modern slavery. So the imports of modern slavery, the industries most at risk are electronics, garments, textiles, palm oil, footwear, and toys. And so that's just imports. So that's goods coming into the country that have been tainted by modern slavery. New Zealand is also, in terms of exporting goods and services, subject to international law, which I'm going to get to in a few minutes. if we just go to the next slide. Um, Here is the timeline of modern slavery legislation in New Zealand because I think it is quite fitting that it's gone up and down, it's gone left to right. But here we are on the 10th of February 2026. The Modern Slavery and Worker Exploitation Bill was introduced in Parliament, and that was bypassing the ballot under the Standing Order 228, and the first time rule has been invoked. And so what we're looking at preparing for is 2028, which is projected the first year of reporting if the bill passes, which gives New Zealand businesses significant time to prepare if they're not reporting in other jurisdictions already. But you can see, we're looking all the way back to June 2021, where World Vision and Trade Aid delivered a 37,000 per signature petition to urge the government. A lot of advocacy occurred in between 2021 and 2023, where the Labor government did announce it would introduce a law requiring businesses to report on modern slavery risks. And then the following year, in May, the coalition government actually disbanded that. So from September last year, there were two private member bills addressing modern slavery lodged. And just as early as this year, it was the announcement of the intention to introduce a cross-party modern slavery bill, which was co-sponsored by Greg Fleming and Camilla Bellich. So if we go to the next slide, the reason why we have confidence in if we just go to the next slide with the global country map, Alicia, the reason why we have confidence in this bill becoming legislation is because New Zealand is behind other countries with these types of reporting regimes. So modern slavery reporting regime in Australia is now in its 8th year, and there is strong signals that mandatory due diligence is likely to be introduced. Some of the export countries, which some New Zealand entities are subject to, is the final revised CSDDD omnibus, which was approved just last month, and that requires large businesses to actually not only report on risk but conduct human rights and environmental due diligence. I don't think anyone wants to talk about the United States right now, so let's move on to Canada. The third reports under the Fighting Against Forced Labour and Child Labour in Supply Chains Act are actually due on the 31st of May 2026, and the UK has a Modern Slavery Act. So if we just go back to the previous slide on the cross-party bill, this does signal that it allows it to bypass the biscuit tin ballot process if the cross-party support of at least 61 members of parliament is secured. So this reduces the political volatility, which was what stalled the previous bill. It also signals durability, not just short-term policy, and it more closely aligns New Zealand with global human rights regulatory regimes such as the UK, Canada, and Australia. If we just go to the next slide, please. What does this bill contain? And I think this is probably why everyone's here today, to unpack very simply what it means and what companies need to do about it. So the first thing I'm going to address is who actually needs to report. Companies operating in New Zealand with an annual revenue above 100 million will need to report. There also is a requirement that overseas companies operating or supplying goods and services to New Zealand may be captured depending on their structure and revenue attribution. So, I actually got the privilege of spending a lot of time in New Zealand over summer, and then previously what I know about New Zealand, and it's one of the things I actually love most about New Zealand, is the significance of small businesses in the New Zealand economy. which would be having nowhere near the $100 million revenue. And so in New Zealand, I mean, I just thought it was incredible. And this is a bit of a tangent. When I was in New Zealand, I spent most of my time going to local bookstores because, in terms of the publishing industry, I think that you have. The most incredible independent publishing businesses and small businesses, but these small businesses will actually be affected by the legislation because those small businesses are suppliers to reporting entities with revenue over 100 million. So I'm going to get to that, but just in terms of like not switching off, if your company doesn't earn over $100 million in revenue, this legislation will still inadvertently affect you because it's very likely you're a supplier to a business who does have to report. So this is what will need to be reported: the structure, operations, and supply chains of the reporting entity. In relation to the structure, what we often find is that because of the complexity of corporate structure, often risk is held not just in the parent company, but also the subsidiaries, which need to be taken in account as to how you map their supply chain. And so then the second require is a description of any modern slavery incident that has occurred. Because you're mapping the supply chain, that's not just with your company, but also, of any subsidiary companies. So has any modern slavery incident occurred? A description of any known or anticipated risks of modern slavery. And here's where requirement 1 and 3 link together, because you're not required just to report a description of any known or anticipated risks of modern slavery in your business, but also your supply chain. Because what we know about modern slavery is often risk is hidden deep within the supply chain. So unless you are able to map your supply chain to the point that you know modern slavery risk is in, you won't fulfill requirement 3. And so that's really important because it's very unlikely that the Apple store in Auckland is exploiting their workers, but we know the cobalt that is going into lithium batteries maybe has an anticipated risk of modern slavery, of child labor, and so that supply chain mapping is going to become very important. Actions taken to assess, prevent, address, and mitigate modern slavery. So, what actions are your business taking? Do you have policies in place? Are you undertaking due diligence? Do you have remediation? What's your governance framework, and what's your process for actually assessing, preventing, and addressing and mitigating modern slavery? Then we have the number of complaints made to the reporting entity and any measures taken to investigate and remediate. And this is really important because remediation has been included in there. So and when I get into what to do, looking into how and whether your company is set up even to receive complaints of modern slavery to investigate and remediate. And then how do you assess effectiveness? What does this mean for your company? How are you tracking this? How are you measuring success? Any training provided to the entity's employees to identify modern slavery? This is really important because when the Modern Slavery Act first came into effect in Australia, companies provided these company-wide training, but it wasn't specific to the eyes on the ground. So, for example, if you were a port, the training that your finance team got should actually be very different to if you were actually working at the port, bringing the ships in, looking at flags of convenience, etc. So specific training is recommended, but I know I'm jumping ahead of myself. And then a description of any consultation undertaken with any employees. So for those New Zealand companies reporting in Australia, it does very closely follow the reporting requirements in Australia, but has nuanced differences. Okay, if we just go to the next slide. So, how does it compare to other legislative regimes? It builds on international models, but it does have some distinctive elements. And so it actually goes further than the Australian and UK models. As I said, I wish I was a Kiwi. I love New Zealand, and I think you guys punch way above your population in that when you decide to do something, you just got to like do it better than anyone else. And I love that it has annual public disclosure of modern slavery risk, aligning with the Australia, UK, and Canada, but then also actually introduces while it is still subject to the existing laws, the New Zealand framework actually introduces the civil penalties and corporate governance accountability. And so that's really important when you are planning strategically to make planning strategically in your business about what to do because of the corporate governance accountability framework. So you will need to actually implement your strategy into existing frameworks that your board of directors are happy to sign off on. And then it also requires complaints handling and incident reporting, which is not always required in other regimes. Okay, how businesses should Sorry, sorry about that. So there's no transition period if the bill passes before the end of 2026. And so that would mean that there's no grace period. The reporting obligations could apply in the first financial year after commencement. There's no grace period or uplift year, which means that reporting would actually begin in the financial year of 2027 with statements potentially due in 2028, and civil penalties would apply from commencement. Okay, if we just go to the next statement. Why businesses should act now. So, the advice for New Zealand businesses who meet the proposed reporting threshold is to actually start preparing now because you are going to be reporting retrospectively. And I've pulled these points from what it looked like in Australia, and we work with over 130 companies in Australia and actually 600,000 suppliers in Australia. So here are the main themes that we've seen. Um, in terms of why I think businesses should act now and what they should do. Because you have to map the supply chain. To map the supply chain, you need to understand what you're spending money on. So that's essentially all of the businesses that you're spending money on. They could be hundreds, there could be thousands. And if you don't understand what form your spend data is in, then when the comes into effect, there may be some retrospective data scrambling and it becomes like spreadsheet hell on earth because there's multiple stakeholders in the business handling multiple data sources and you need to consolidate it. So whatever technique you're going to use for structured supply chain mapping, you need all of your spend data. So ensuring that that is in, you have access to that, or whoever your procurement system, it's classified by industry and country, because that's generally how you look at modern slavery risk. So whether all of your spend data has a unique business identifier and is also classified by industry and country, that's one of the things that you should be doing now. Suppliers, what we found in Australia, especially when the Modern Slavery Act came into effect, is suppliers got really fatigued at last minute requests and almost like got scared because they were just getting these supplier self-assessment questionnaires and thought they were in trouble or thought if they didn't answer correctly, they'd lose contracts and just got too many of them. And so if you can start having the conversation with your suppliers before the legislation becomes in effect, it's going to make your job easier. And that's because you don't want your suppliers to feel like they're getting in trouble, especially if so many of them are small businesses. You just want them to understand why you're asking them the questions, why they might get a supplier assessment questionnaire, and what they need to do. One of the things that we've, think would be a really good idea is to have a pack for smaller suppliers as to why companies are asking them for information, education on what they can do that is actually proportional to the size and sophistication of their business. The controlled board engagement is another really important why, because again, what happened in Australia is that it didn't get to the boards until the statement was due in some cases, and then because the directors are the approving authority, they didn't have the training or have the modern slavery implemented into their risk register soon enough. So, in terms of ensuring that your board is informed, that they understand that they are an approving authority for the statement, and that they understand what the risks are, and what on a more frequent basis is something that we highly recommend. And then again, just as a lower cost implementation if you're getting these things set up now, because actually writing the statement should be a reflection of what you've done over time. There's been many examples of high cost outlays for last minute implementation. Okay, if we just go to the next slide, what should you be doing? And I know I've covered some of that, but if we go into the next slide, basically companies should start thinking about a bit of a gaps analysis. So assess your scope and governance readiness. In Australia, what happened was companies set up like modern slavery governance in a silo. And then, as the years passed and they realized how cross-functional the policies had to be implemented, and the due diligence that was undertaken on suppliers, they saw a better way, which I really recommend, is to assess your existing governance policies and actually bring in modern slavery governance, modern slavery risk and governance into existing procedures. So don't try and reinvent the wheel. You might need some additional policies somewhere, but actually do a audit of your existing governance frameworks and try and implement modern slavery provisions into those. Mapping supply chain exposure, I have actually touched on that, but what we know, in circumstances where you're in a high risk industry in New Zealand, it might be at tier one that you have modern slavery risk, but really it's more likely that your modern slavery exposure is going to be deeper in your supply chain, and you're going to be, probably less causally linked to that, but the bill requires you to identify that. So ensure that you are mapping your supply chain. And then establish data collection and due diligence processes. And that doesn't mean you do the same due diligence for every supplier, because once you've mapped your supply chain and assessed your risk, you're not going to have to do the same level of due diligence for every supplier. If you're importing solar panels from Xinjiang, you're going to have to do a very different due diligence to if you're have used the same mum and dad catering business for 20 years to deliver the board lunches to your business. And so ensure that you've done your risk mapping, and then you're applying appropriate due diligence to high risk, medium risk, and low risk. And I'm going to go through what that could look like in a moment. And then you have to strengthen an incident and complaint mechanism. So I always use the example, but it's actually not funny, because this is what a lot of companies did, is that they just actually called whoever provided their whistleblower hotline and said, oh, we want to add modern slavery to that. So if you think of who's going to be using those complaint mechanisms, I always say, okay, well, take the migrant construction worker. What are the chances, if there is an incident of modern slavery risk, them being aware of your internal whistleblower hotline? And two, what's going to happen if they, in say broken English, report that to your existing whistleblower hotline? What's actually going to happen? So ensure that you have an incident and complaint mechanism that is fit for purpose for those most vulnerable to modern slavery. And there are lots of worker voice and hotlines that have been set up for this, and we are seeing we are seeing that. So how far, sorry, we've just got a question. How far down the supply chain do you need to look? Um, that is not specified, but it is beyond your direct operations. So whether you go from production to consumption or whether you go to where there is most likely the risk, which we see aggregating in around tier two or three for most companies. Beyond tier three, there is a little bit of a law of diminishing returns. Generally, modern slavery exposure is in tier two or three for countries in New Zealand. Step five is draft reporting templates. So, you can templatize a lot of this work. This isn't a marketing document, it is a compliance document. And so just following the mandatory requirements and it being a reflection of what you've done throughout the year, it can be very, very well systematized. Next slide. Okay. The first step is assessing readiness. So, like understanding whether your organization is likely to fall within the revenue and operational thresholds and assign clear board and executive oversight for modern slavery risk. This is an example of a governance structure that I think is excellent. So you can see here how the Woolworths Group in 2025 actually set up their governance structure for assessing and approving their modern slavery statements. They had a sustainability committee, a risk committee, CEO and executive committee, human rights committee, working groups, and group functions. Obviously, this has to be proportional to the size of and sophistication of your business, but determining what governance structure you're going to have for this new piece of legislation is becoming increasingly important. If we just go to the next slide, here's where we talk about how to map your supply chain exposure. So we have your company, tier one suppliers, tier two suppliers, and tier three suppliers. So basically, what you should do first is identify the key spend categories. A lot of companies have materiality thresholds because they've got such a long tail. And I actually think that's okay because where you are spending the most amount of money, you're likely to have the greatest influence. There is it arguably looking at it at a per dollar spent is also important because some of your low spend suppliers may be your most risky, but taking a position within the business is actually really important as to how you're going to apply a salient risk assessment or a materiality threshold. Once you've done that, you should be looking at geographic risk exposure. So, are you purchasing from high risk countries? And are you purchasing from high risk sectors and high risk products? And that should form the basis of how you prioritize your high risk assessments at each tier of the supply chain. If you just go to the next slide, here are just some examples of how I would identify high risk suppliers. So sector and industry risk, geographic risk, products and services and entity risks. And so I've just given some examples of there, but organizations with no understanding of modern slavery, poor governments, unethical business practices and a known risk. So a lot of the work that we've been doing in Australia in the energy industry at the moment is as companies decarbonising the modern slavery risks with electric vehicles and batteries of electric vehicles and how we engage with organisations. Do we have an SME? Yes. Yeah. So we can, I'm actually going to be in New Zealand in April, and one of the things that I want to do there is provide to New Zealand businesses an SME pack because governance at SMEs is like completely different. And so that pack includes what is modern slavery, what a SME modern slavery policy looks like. So basically for SMEs, they still should have a modern slavery policy so that they can undertake an appropriate level of due diligence for their suppliers, but they should actually be provided with sufficient education and training by reporting entities because it's very unlikely that they're aware of these obligations. And what you don't want is, you know, your reporting obligations to stop their license to do business with you. And so I highly recommend providing them with example policies that they can implement themselves and primarily education and training. And I think retrospectively, that's what should have been done in Australia is equipping is equipping SMEs. And so how can they set up very simple governance structures? They don't need committees, but they do need to have policies and they do need to be undertaking due diligence where appropriate. And that can all be systematized and templatized and essentially be given for free. So SME stands for small medium enterprises. Great. So if we go to the next slide, um, develop structured processes for gathering the data. So I've put like move from broad and shallow to a deep focus because like it's going to be way too much. Like it's going to be both redundant and way too much work to say you're going to focus on every single supplier. So, you might have a materiality threshold of a certain amount, and that's also reducing the pressure on SMEs, but then you go really deep. So you might say, well, this year we're going to focus on doing really deep due diligence on electric vehicles or these these very well-known modern slavery risks, as opposed to just doing the same thing for everyone, putting unnecessary pressure on small, medium enterprises, and then, also just taking a broad brush approach. So that's what we recommend for due diligence. If we just go to the next slide, this is essentially, again, some learnings in terms of allocating sufficient time and resources. Who in your company is actually going to be responsible for this? 7 years later, there are still reporting entities where this just gets dumped on people at the last minute, but like having someone or a specific person, role within your organization is really important. And so the other thing in terms of the allocation of sufficient time and resources, because we've been working with companies for 7 years in Australia, sometimes if this is just put on one person, when that person leaves the company, the person who replaces them, they start from day one. And so we would recommend resourcing this cross-functionally so you don't lose institutional knowledge if some person leaves. And so having a modern slavery working group is really important so that that institutional knowledge is not made redundant. I have already spoken about narrow and deep rather than broad and shallow focus. Include opportunities for external collaboration. There is definitely pre-competitive, anti-competitive working groups that you can form with other members in your industry where a lot of the resources and education is shared. I would say like we work with a lot of industry working groups, and there's given how many small businesses there are in New Zealand and like what a tight-knit business community you are, there is a lot of opportunity for external collaboration. Just keep on top of emerging trends and development. So you all would have gotten invited to this webinar. You'll get emails from Fair Supply. We'll always, if there's something you need to know, we'll always be the first to tell you. So just keep staying informed of those emerging trends, and then triage the nature and extent of the due diligence, because, as I said before, if you're purchasing solar panels from China then that's a very different level of due diligence that would be agriculture in New Zealand or Australia. And so really triage the nature, triage the nature and extent of due diligence to reflect the assessed risk. Yes, following this presentation, you'll get an email probably tomorrow with both the recording and this presentation, and also just feel free to yeah, we will definitely be sharing. Thanks, Alicia. Also, just feel free to circulate this as widely as possible. I'm also going to be in New Zealand in April, so we'll probably reach out for a meeting, maybe an event where we can share more information about what's happening because we expect to get more information towards the end of this month. Yeah, so Jacqueline has just said this is very similar to the practical requirements reporting for, yeah, emissions and carbon neutral. So I think that exactly. And so if your company has been on that journey, it's very likely that you can probably follow a similar framework or process to other compliance requirements you've got, especially in climate, which did probably involve the collection of all of your spend data. But again, the best advice that we've seen in Australia is don't try and reinvent the wheel just because this is a separate, exactly, AML, CFT, exactly. You've all done this process before. So don't try and reinvent the wheel and think just because it's modern slavery and an issue that you might not know as much about. There's going to be a governance framework and a process within your organization that, if not, is a like for like to apply to this, is essentially just it may require some tweaks, but what this doesn't involve is you reinventing the wheel because it's not actually that dissimilar to other reporting requirements that you have in other areas of the business. So thanks for calling that out. That's 100% right. Okay, if we just go to the next slide. Um, Here is an example of due diligence actions based on the supplier level of risk. So one of the things that I've been talking about, um, I would love to present anywhere. I'm being a little bit I don't want to be that Aussie that comes into New Zealand and is the one that all of the Kiwis hate, but I will present anywhere, anytime, and that's an open invitation to all of you guys. Um, this is just an example. So if I was coming into your organization as a consultant, I would say once you've done your supply chain mapping and have categorized all of your suppliers into elevated, moderate, and low risk suppliers, here is some due diligence actions that would be proportional. So for your low risk suppliers, and this is what I'm saying, like don't put too much unnecessary pressure on your low risk suppliers, like I'm just, memories of all of the amazing places I ate at Queenstown where, the owner of the restaurant was the cook and the waiter. I'm not going to be going and asking them to look in the kitchen and conduct worker interviews or expect third-party certifications. I will send them a supplier self-assessment questionnaire, which is proportional to me knowing that they are a mum and dad small business. I'm not going to expect them to have remediation policies. I'm not going to expect their level of sophistication to be the same as I would expect Woolworths to be. And I'll just periodically do that. I'm not going to bombard them with too many onerous obligations, but I am going to involve them in collaborative training and awareness raising. So they're the three things I would do for your low risk suppliers. For your moderate risk suppliers, so it's like, okay, well, we do have to purchase solar panels and we need to find out more about this company. You can do supplier specific desktop auditing. So I can show you how we do that at Fair Supply. There's always going to be a sales pitch, but I'm leaving it to the last minute. In terms of just looking up the company, somebody mentioned AML before, same as you would do on like a world check or something, just type in the company and do the desktop auditing. If they are flagged as having reported issues, you will need to do some targeted disclosure requests, because what might come up is that they have had a reported issue, but they've actually remediated. So you will need to do some very targeted supplier disclosure through your procurement team, as you would when you're onboarding any supplier for any other reason. There might be collaborative supplier engagement, because it's very likely that the majority of you on this webinar are using the same suppliers. So you don't need to, again, share any commercially sensitive information, but it might be worth, if you are having to do targeted supplier disclosure, to do it as a group, because otherwise, say, 6 or 7 of you are going to be asking the suppliers the exact same questions, getting the exact same answers. But if you do that through an industry group, it's going to save time and money. And again, periodic individual supplier monitoring. If you do have elevated risks of suppliers, there are some cases where you will need to do on-site auditing and undertaking work interviews to ensure appropriate due diligence. There's also some reputable third-party certifications that suppliers may be able to provide you that satisfies that they are mitigating their risk appropriately, and then having a long-term anti-slavery supplier partnership. So ensuring that you're working with your suppliers to get them to address that risk effectively. Okay, strengthening your incident and complaint mechanism. So I touched on this before, but ensuring internal grievance channels and complaints handling systems are capable of identifying and responding to modern slavery mechanisms. Like, I can't imagine calling a whistleblower hotline by a consulting firm as a, you know, person who is vulnerable to modern slavery and actually has a grievance to report. So you really need to involve workers in relevant groups to tailor the policies to the real needs and context. There needs to be worker-driven social responsibility. I've said empower workers with on-site education, all of that, but really, like, when we've worked with the Australian companies. So for example, for cleaners, we've stuck posters in about the complaint mechanism in the cleaning closet. We have had, if you look at moderns, there's a lot of evidence to support raising awareness about modern slavery should be a very similar strategy to a public health campaign. So posters on the back of toilets at airports works really well. Alignment with international standards. Like, you can obviously, depending on what business you're in, like, you can choose to just do this for New Zealand. But if you're importing, exporting, I would be ensuring that your mechanisms are aligned with international human rights standards. They should be legitimate, accessible, predictable, equitable, transparent, and rights compatible. So with modern slavery, it's the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the OECD guidelines. And then a comprehensive remediation process. So provide the practical tools, real world case studies and expertise to guide businesses in their human rights and grievance remediation processes. Next slide, please. Here's an example of a grievance mechanism for the brand Zimmerman. They had implemented it in 11 key factories in China. There was a confidential reporting channel for workers to report concerns. They received in-person training supplemented by handouts, and it actually provided really good insight into working conditions, and the facilities had access to remedy. They supported capacity building within the factories. Next slide, please. When you actually have done all of this and come to drafting the report, you can prepare templates that would be adapted to meet the disclosure requirements. And so it's a good idea to establish an internal review and approval process and run a dry board update ahead of any formal legislation. Um, Okay, so assign ownership, make claims traceable, acknowledge gaps honestly, and run a dry run now. I think the best practical advice with acknowledge gaps honestly is also to point out that the company should take a position on how much they want to disclose. So Woolworths was celebrated as, an incredibly leading modern slavery statement, which I agree with. They actually made really deep, they were very transparent. They actually acknowledged the existence of modern slavery and were celebrated for their transparency. There was a case in Australia that was brought by a rights holder against West Farmers in relation to Kmart disclosing some of their factories, which had associations with forced labor in Xinjiang. Now, they were very transparent, again, in the spirit of legislation being transparent, and a claim was brought against them. So, it is really important before you start implementing this, understanding what position your company wants to take. So we're working with companies who want minimum compliance, don't like this is commercial, we're more commercial, we don't want to be as transparent as possible, to companies who like, we want to be leaders, we want to be transparent. But if you're running this program, you actually need to know from the outset what position your company is taking. Okay, if we just go to the next slide. We can help you prepare. As I said, we are working with many New Zealand companies already, and New Zealand OCS and companies in the energy industry. We are the software. I know there was a question earlier. We are the software that maps supply chains and undertakes automated supplier due diligence and embeds procurement control. So essentially, the way that our software works is that we take spend data, map the supply chain, and identify risk. We then prioritize it, and those companies that need to be sent a self-assessment questionnaire, we have a range of self-assessment questionnaires that can be sent out to your suppliers proportional to their size and sophistication. We then automatically score that and provide you with a report and a level of controls to document your due diligence process. So promise, that's my only sales pitch. There is a QR code there, but I really think that prior to the legislation being passed, the best thing that we can do for New Zealand companies right now is educate them and ensure that every company is ready for what's coming. So that concludes my presentation. I am going to open up to questions. I see that we've got one more in the chat. While the modern slavery bill remains on the daily order, it's well down the list. Yeah, it could be caught up. Yeah, it's unlikely to get through before the election. I think this is very strategic, the way that the bill was introduced, because it does bypass what happened. Like what happened last time, where it was dependent on the election. I don't think anyone can predict what's going to happen in Parliament at the moment, but I do think there are a lot of advocacy teams working really, really hard on this. So I think it's hard to say this because we've said it again, but this is really going to happen. I actually do think this is really going to happen. Yeah, okay, this is a really great question. What does the ranking mean? So when you're measuring modern slavery risk, there's two things that you have to measure. So what you're measuring is the inherent risk. So are we spending money on high risk industries and countries? So that's where we've taken all of the industries and countries in the world and ranked the industries into 5 categories. However, what we're also looking at is what the companies in that industry are doing to mitigate their risk. Because what we're not expecting you to do is change your business operations. So I'll give a really good example of that. Most companies need to buy solar panels. Solar panels are in a really high risk industry, generally in a high risk country because of their supply chain and their links to Xinjiang in China. We can't, and we won't tell companies to stop purchasing things that they need to purchase for the running of their business. But just because a business is operating in a high risk industry and country doesn't mean that they're not mitigating risk appropriately. So we're also providing a residual score once we've engaged with those suppliers to understand what that company is doing to mitigate their risk, and we're providing a residual score. If we flip that on its head, there might be companies who are terrible, but they're operating in a low risk industry and country. And so that's why we're giving you two scores, because it doesn't mean that just because they're operating in a high risk industry and country, they're not doing a good job at mitigating modern slavery. And similarly, just because they're operating in a low risk industry and country doesn't mean that they're doing a good job of modern slavery. And so we are providing insight into both, because when you're prioritizing for due diligence, you do want to know which of your suppliers are at greater risk. Then we're giving you the mitigation score and the residual score. Okay, great. What are the resource requirements for, yeah, so supplier portfolio? It depends if you're trying to do it yourself, because like we say that the biggest competition, well, the biggest competition to an automated software doing this for you is your spreadsheet. So in the start of the Australian legislation, it was taking one FTE to engage with all of the suppliers manually, because you're just constantly getting questions, assessing them. But that's not the best way to do it, because if you're getting responses from your suppliers, they're not answering them in the same way. So then somebody on the team is actually going to have to look at the responses and try and evaluate apples with oranges. So I think generally what we're seeing now, depending on the size of the company, if you are using software, it becomes somebody in the procurement team does that as they would any other due diligence process. So in terms of in terms of the typical resource requirements, I would go back to how many resources is it taking your company to do AML due diligence or carbon reporting, and I would say it's the equivalent resources of those other regulatory requirements. The way we look at tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers is based on global economic modeling. So we don't look at, well, in some cases we do predictively, but we look at who are your suppliers and what is the global supply chain of that to show tiers 2 and tiers 3, because what happens at tiers 2 and tier 3 is that the risk is measured by industry and country. So our software automatically maps your entire supply chain to tier 10. So you're not going to have to ask your suppliers, who are your suppliers? Who are your suppliers? Who are your suppliers? Because you're never going to get any comprehensive data on that. A supply chain is not always linear. What happens is you might have 700 suppliers, and then those 700 suppliers have 1,400 suppliers. And so very quickly it becomes impossible to engage with all of them. And so we're mapping tier 2 and 3 suppliers through what's called a multi-regional input-output table, which is government information down to tier 10. Okay, next question. Do reports typically limit mentioned companies? No. So, yeah. Sorry, I'll just read that question out. Do reports typically limit the mentioned companies in their supply chain to just those they purchase goods and services from in high risk amounts? So if they purchased $1 million worth of goods, or is it an amount of engagement with supplier irrelevant to how high a risk a supplier is? So for the purpose of the modern slavery report, you need to be identifying the risk, and then the due diligence is the engagement. So it's again how you're setting your materiality threshold. Some companies do it by spend amount because they know they've got more influence over that, but there could be a really high risk supplier that you're buying the Christmas decorations from and you're not engaging with them at all. So the first thing you should do is set out a salience test and how your company is going to identify risk, and then the high risk companies based on that model should be the target for due diligence. Okay, Ruth, if there is a multi-regional input-output table, yep, it is useful for understanding risk, but not for engagement. So then, yeah, you don't need to do a manual deep dive. I'd love to show you all. Once we understand who the supplier is, we then have essentially an automated desktop audit on that supplier. So you're absolutely right. The multi-regional input-output table is useful for identifying the risks, but once those risks are identified, you need to essentially assess the risk of the actual company. And so there's tools that we use to actually engage with the company. We're using quite a lot of knowledge graphs and AI empowered with human in the loop to be able to actually automate those desktop audits on individual companies, because previously you would have to actually undertake that manual deep dive. And if you're doing that, like that's quite labor intensive. So part of our platform is identifying the risk beyond tier one, and then part of our platform is actually company searches and all of the aggregated information, which is the equivalent of a manual deep dive. The legislation in Australia does cover the not-for-profit sector, provided that the revenue is over 100 million. We actually work with a lot of not-for-profit organizations. And one of the things that is a little bit different for the not-for-profit organization, or at least our advice is to them anyway, is sometimes their programs are actually set up to address the underlying risks of exploitation leading to modern slavery. So an example of that is a not-for-profit that is educating women and girls in a high-risk country. It would be redundant in circumstances where their programmatic impact is actually addressing some of the high risk factors of modern slavery in those industry and country, to ask them, hey, where are you getting your pens from? So that's when it comes back to the materiality threshold. But if we're a medical, we also do a lot of work for medical not-for-profits, and we don't want the rubber gloves that they're using to be made by slaves. So there are nuances to the not-for-profit sector, but it does cover it. I really want to honor your time, but I also would love to engage more with everybody. So I'll wrap up the webinar now, but we'll be in touch. We'll circulate these slides, and I'll also just put my email. I think we might have I don't know if we've got a QR code, but feel free to email me and I'll be in touch. Would love to see as many of you as possible in New Zealand next month. Thank you, everyone.